Greetings, fellow fans, and welcome to my series of interviews with folks who have worked on Transformers. My first interview is with Simon Furman. Furman was originally the writer who ran the Marvel UK Transformers title, and years later, he would go on to take over the main Transformers book in the US. Over the years, his involvement with Transformers continued, where he would write the Generation 2 series, he would do some work for Dreamwave, and of course, IDW Publishing. I was fortunate enough to meet Simon at BotCon many, many years ago. And eventually, we actually collaborated on a couple of projects. One was the final episode of the Beast Wars series, where I kind of played my Transformers fan consultant role. And then later, we would work on the Beast Wars source book together. Simon and I got together in May, and we had an interview, a bit of a catch up, and it was a really fun conversation, and I hope you enjoy it. Simon, thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate your time.
Pleasure, Ben. Always a pleasure.
All right, let's go way back in time. Let's not think about how many years it is, just back in time. And can you tell us how you decided to land on writing as a profession?
Yeah, I mean, but more by luck than anything. You know, I'd always loved comics. You know, I've remained a comics fan after a lot of people had given up on it. But, you know, I don't think I had any clue you could make a living doing it. But I ended up working for IPC magazines in a journalistic capacity. And that just got me in on their ground level of comics, which included 2000 AD and Eagle and a bunch of others. And roundabout way, I ended up working on a comic called Scream, and that gave me my first actual opportunity to write something, just because we were so often in deadline crunches, and often I just had to jump in and you know, I'd always wanted to write a comic strip. So, you know, I did a lot of reading of John Wagner Judge Dredd strips, and just to get the kind of way a script should be put together. And that was it, really. I did a bunch for Scream, and then pretty soon after that, Scream was closed up, and I moved to Marvel UK with Ian Rimmer, who was the editor on Scream, and then became an editor over at Marvel UK.
Wonderful. Now, what would you cite as your biggest influences in your writing? It could be any media, books, comics, movies, and so on.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots. I mean, I was a big movie fan, so, you know, movie references and influences creep into my stuff all the time. You know, in that kind of mid-teens bit where I was less into comics, I was seriously into movies. So, you know, a lot of stuff. You know, I only the other day I posted a picture of the poster to a film called Rollerball, which was a 70s kind of action game film that made a big impact on me. I think I saw it when I was like 14 or something. Very violent for the time, but it centered around this whole idea of, you know, a game that was supposed to appease the violent instincts of the masses, so there were no more wars. And that just really appealed to me. And so influences like that crept into later things like Dragon's Claws and To the Death. And, you know, just generally, you know, I can pick out where a lot of my comics influences come from movies rather than comics. But at the same time, I was big into Marvel comics, you know, Stan Lee's stuff. I loved their whole sort of overblown gods and monsters, you know, galactic soap operas that, you know, really became part and parcel of, you know, the Unicron Primus and other storylines that fed into Transformers. That idea of these massive godlike beings like Galactus or Ego, the living planet, just became Primus and Unicron to me. So, you know, there was a lot of, you know, comics influence from that Stan Lee, Kirby, Ditko era that crept into my writing, and then latterly I loved Chris Claremont's writing on X-Men. I loved how he juggled subplots all the time. You know, that he'd had 3 or 4 subplots ticking along while the main storyline was going. And, you know, and Alan Moore's writing, just because he had that real good grasp of language and picture and how one can show off the other really effectively if used well. So, you know, I think those were that cluster of influences that I brought to bear on my writing.
It is interesting how when you're younger, especially in your maybe preteen, teen years, that certain media you're exposed to, some things just latch onto your brain and won't let go. I know for me, Blade Runner was one of those things. You know, I saw that probably very inappropriately at a very young age in the theaters, and that opening visual of the city and the flames going to the air and the eye and everything, like it was one of the few things I could say at that point in my young life that my brain just said instantly, I am fascinated by this and I can't stop watching this and I want to absorb everything. Uh, yeah.
And I had a whole load of movies from around that time, like Alien, Warriors, you know, that made a deep impact on me just in the way they told their stories, and how, you know, how visceral I found my reaction to them. You know, Rollerball was the same, even though bits of Rollerball are kind of boring. The games were intensely exciting. You know, Warriors, it was one of the few times I came out of a theater sort of really sort of pumped up. You know, the adrenaline was going through. It was such a kind of exciting movie experience.
Absolutely. And that's an excellent reference. And it is interesting because I can see how it was a different era of movies back then. I feel it was a lot more post-apocalyptic type films, even if they weren't set after a nuclear apocalypse or something, but it had that theme of this future environment that was very dangerous and very gritty, and something that uh, would be difficult to imagine back then. I think, sadly, now I think we can actually kind of imagine some of them. But I think back then as a kid, it really opened my mind to the possibility of look at the world differently than it is in front of you. And I think that's why, as a genre, sci-fi, Transformers has always attracted me so much.
Yeah, same here. And you know, the 70s for me was such a rich time for sci-fi movies. You know, there was Rollerball, there was Soylent Green, there was the Planet of the Apes sequels. You know, I there were so many good sci-fi movies and offbeat sci-fi movies like Silent Running, and you know, all these other films, Dark Star. You know, I mean, I it was such a good time for sci-fi that wasn't formulaic sci-fi. So, you know, I think that inspired me a lot.
Awesome. Now, that eventually, of course, led you down the road to Transformers. How did you get your foot in the door with Transformers and then ultimately wind up becoming the writer?
Well, mostly it's down to Ian Rimmer again, who, you know, before I moved over to Marvel UK, he'd already become an editor there, and he knew that Sheila Cranner, the editor on what was then the very fledgling Transformers comic in the UK, was in need of writers. You know, they needed to produce their own material. They had Steve Parkhouse doing a first story, and basically they just needed a writer, or writers preferably, to carry on doing that, to fill out this hiatus really between each new influx of US reprint material. Marvel, the Marvel series in the US was reprinting, but there simply wasn't enough of it to fill a weekly, or in fact a bi-weekly and then a weekly comic. So very quickly they realized they needed original content, and it was just very lucky, you know. And I had no knowledge of Transformers, I hadn't seen any of the cartoon. We were just handed a bunch of reference, you know, probably the US miniseries, and told to go away and come up with pretty much self-contained storylines. But of course, I felt this was going to be a 1 or 2 story gig at best. But then I ended up working on staff there, and I think I just became the most convenient go-to guy for the next story and the next story.
Makes sense. And now, in that in between space that you had to occupy with the UK title, how much did you coordinate with Bob Budiansky in the US, or if at all?
Well, initially, hardly at all. I don't think Bob was aware of us, and those lines of communication weren't really open. I think they would send us plots and art and things, but I don't think they were very aware of us other than we existed. And, we weren't really in touch. Certainly, I wasn't in touch with Bob at the time. But over the months and then years that followed, we became much more in contact with Marvel US. We had Jim Shooter come over, Tom DeFalco, then Bob came over, then I went over there. So gradually, this relationship just kind of built up, and it was much easier to know what was going on because Bob was, in much more direct contact with us. Sometimes Bob was the go-to guy rather than the editorial office, just because he really was the driving force behind that whole comic book.
Now, eventually, you took over the title from Bob, kind of in its latter third of its existence. How did that come about? And I know there has been conversation in the past about how Hasbro would kind of throw a bunch of toys at writers and say, introduce that, if for both the cartoon and the comic book. Did you suddenly have to deal with that instead of just writing the stories as you had previously?
Not so much. By the time I took over, really, Micromasters were already in the comic. And other than Action Masters, there weren't really a huge amount of toys left to introduce. So, in a way, I took over at a perfect time because there wasn't that, introduce another 10, 20, 30 characters, which I think Bob was always saddled with a little bit. So we had to kind of clear the decks, bring in the next characters, clear the decks. So, and I think Bob, by that time that we met up, he came over to London, and, I think he was just pretty burned out on Transformers. He'd done however many, 40, 50 issues. And, he was ready for just to pass the book on. And I have a feeling this terrified the editorial office on Transformers because they had no clue who they could get to replace Bob, except that Bob did. By then we were, not just in touch, we were friendly. We got on really well on both sort of times we met up. So, it was all very casual in the end. Bob came over, we went out to lunch, and more or less over lunch, he just said, do you want to take over the book? And, he did say it's a declining book. Probably, you've got 6 months, a year, if you're lucky. But, to me, that would be my first work for Marvel US. So I was, grab it with both hands, as a door opener, which indeed it was. But in the end, of course, we got maybe 25 issues out of that. So, it turned into good. But yes, the restraints were off in as much as Hasbro weren't as closely watching what we were doing, I guess. So I was able to import a lot of the things I'd set up in the UK comic, like Primus and Unicron, and and just go. The animated movie had impressed us all so much, and it fed into many of the UK stories. So it just felt a natural to import that to the US comic, set up the same origin we'd set up in the UK comic with Primus, and just generally, we were selling, we were maintaining the comic. So Marvel were happy, Hasbro were happy, and, they just weren't as focused on what we were doing. So we got that latitude to go a little crazy with the book, I guess, and just throw in human super teams and, global conflicts and then cosmic conflicts. So, I think when the end came, it was all very sudden and we had to wrap up. But really, we could have carried on for many more issues. We had plans stretching out to, another 10, 20 issues that we were slowly going to build up to. So yeah, it was great fun while it lasted.
It always felt to me once you took over that the book did change a bit in tone. For lack of a better term, it felt a little more Marvel comic booky. I just made that up.
Yeah.
With the galactic stuff, the mysticism that you introduced and so on. Bob did a little bit of that, but I think, as you said earlier, he was so sidled with having to introduce 10 toys every few issues that it really, I'm guessing, constrained him to a certain
Yeah.
degree of what he could do. And you had just a cast and you could just go forward.
I mean, I think we were lucky in the UK. We had almost exclusive access to the movie characters, the animated movie characters, and Galvatron and things like that. And that really made the UK comic soar in its own direction. So when I moved over to the US comic, it just felt, it's too good not to go that same route, in a different way, but to take that cosmic, somewhat dimension, time traveling feel to it. And just, we at that point, like I say, I was definitely channeling that sort of Stanley Kirby influence of, let's just go, Thor level with this. Let's go Fantastic Four level with it. And it's outer space, it's cosmic. There are beings who, we know there's a being who can consume planets. So, let's go with that. It just
Well,
felt like a bit of a no-brainer.
and with Matrix Quest, you really got to play with the genre, which I always thought was a fun idea.
And again, one of my influences, definitely, I don't read, strangely, a lot of sci-fi, but I do read a lot of private eye, pulp fiction, noir stuff. Crime is far more my thing, I guess. And so it was lovely to be able to, do our Maltese Falcon riff and then do a Moby Dick riff, and then, and just generally dabble in all these different genres, aliens, it was just, in some ways, I think, because editorial, because Hasbro weren't really just saying no, no, no to things, we could just do whatever. And I think that really helped the comic because it just began to feel like this space opera, sort of big storyline, and I think, Bob's final episodes on the comic had become quite short and episodic. They were one-offs largely, and I'd really wanted to get back into that thing I was telling you about the sort of Chris Claremont subplot of always having subplots building in the background, so that whatever was front and center, there's something else building in the background that's the next storyline and the next. So, we just had that latitude, and I just brought all those influences to bear.
Awesome. Now, throughout your run on G1, from the time you were only in the UK all the way to taking over the US title, was there any exposure on your part to the showrunners or writers or anyone from the animated program? Did you even watch it at that point?
Yeah, I mean, we were definitely aware of it. We didn't really have contact with their writers, their creative people. But on the UK comic, we felt the need to at least acknowledge its existence because we realized our audience were seeing the cartoon. So we did a story called Decepticon Dam Busters, which took a sequence, the Sherman Dam sequence from the first 3 episodes, and made it a story within a story. So we kind of gave it a certain amount of lip service and said, we're aware of this, but that's happening over there, and it's slightly different to what you're reading here. So, but other than that, no, I mean, we had to reprint the adaptation they did of the big broadcast of 2006, which was problematic because we used those characters in another way. And we had to more or less bookend it with a storyline that made it a fiction
Mhm.
within the fiction. So so we had those odd things, but what we did most of all was take from the animated movie, which really was the launch platform for you know hundreds of issues almost of UK comics that rolled out after that came out, starting with 2000 Target 2006 and ending with Time Wars. We really ran with that.
One of my first exposures to the UK title was the adventure where Prime winds up on Cybertron teaming up with Outback, and
Yeah.
Magnus is basically hunting him down. And I remember being so confused as a kid as to what was happening, because in the US, Bob had kind of stayed away from a lot of those movie characters for the most part. So all of a sudden, here they all were, but in a completely different context than what I was used to. And that forced me to retroactively go back and figure out what was happening. And back then, I didn't have a Transformers wiki I could go to and read. I had a friend in the UK who was very kind and picked things up for me occasionally, and that was about it. But I do like how you jumped into that. And I think later on, when we talk about Secrets and Lies, there's a little bit of a repeat of having to weave in and out of continuity.
Yeah,
Um,
and we
Go ahead.
absolutely did try and acknowledge the US stories. It wasn't like we were just running our own. As far as our UK audience was concerned, we didn't want them to know there was a US or a UK storyline. So sometimes we just had to tweak bits to make it flow. It was often an ending, or we'd move, when Circuit Breaker was introduced, we had to move that slightly. So we did a little sort of tail end sequence that introduced her in in a reprise more or less of the US, but we'd cut that out originally. And the same with Special Teams. We had to get them in the comic long before they were going to be in through the reprints, just to hit the TV advertising with Hasbro UK. So we had to kind of come up with a way to bring those in without messing up the eventual debut of the Special Teams in the US storyline. So yeah, we did a lot of juggling to make sure it seemed as seamless as possible.
And you went pretty full bore on those Special Teams. They kind of got introduced en masse instead of just the aerial bots, then the Stunticons, then the Constructicons before then. That was an interesting storyline. And again, I read the US one before I read the UK one, and I actually found we were talking earlier about having to introduce toys. I found the Special Teams storyline much more toyetic in that respect, and I don't say that as a bad thing. I actually like that. So I thought it was cool.
I mean, Hasbro UK didn't ask much of us, but it definitely behooved us when they were doing a new product launch to tie the comic into that, because we would often then get a little spot on their TV advertising. So we did it with Special Teams, then we did it with the new leaders, and then we did it with Headmasters. So it was always good for us. It was always a boost for circulation to be, little flash up on the screen of the Transformers comic cover as they're advertising those toys. So it was worth our while to, I suppose, just move things around just to accommodate that.
And I'll tell you, one of the other things I really enjoyed about the character selection that you went through was you often used a lot of characters that either only briefly appeared in the US title or never appeared at all. So with the Wreckers, Jump Starters, guys like Broadside and Sandstorm, they didn't just appear, they had some pretty significant time on the page.
And that was mostly predicated by the fact that the US wasn't using them. So we could do things with them that we couldn't do with Optimus or Megatron, because we didn't know where necessarily the US storyline was going all the time. So yeah, it helped when we had characters that the US storyline hardly touched or didn't touch at all, because they were fair game, really.
Right. Now, speaking of fair game, eventually we're going to fast forward a little bit and go to Generation 2, which I always felt even from a time frame standpoint, was a very in the toy line was a very different animal for you to deal with, because you really didn't have to introduce a whole lot of new characters. I mean, it happened eventually, but your starting point was basically just repaints of existing characters again. So in a way, you could just pick up where you left off. But even in that sense, it was a very different title. It felt very different. Was that Marvel telling you to do something different, or did they just give you freedom and you wanted to do something different?
I mean, I think they gave us a fair amount of freedom on G2 because, I've got to say, I don't think their expectations were high of the comic. It didn't have a TV show, or, at least a new TV show. It didn't have a lot of oomph behind it. And I think Marvel were just like, well, do what you will with it. But it was the 90s, and I think the look and feel of G2 was very much, this is what comics were at the time, that kind of slightly anti-hero, big guns, kind of bullet belt type, stuff that became kind of the foundations of Image. It was very much the time. And I also think, the editor, Rob Tokar, just said, let's not make it like the original comic. Let's give it more edge, more, we're not necessarily, and I think he was right, appealing to the kids here. So, it's definitely more comic fans or older fans who grew up with Transformers, half a decade ago. They're the ones who might pick this up. So I think it was just, we needed to make it a little edgier, a little more in your face than the original comic has been. And like you say, because we weren't necessarily showcasing toys, we could be a little more sort of brutal, I guess, with the actual sort of way that the characters were. We didn't have that sense of, this character can't do that because they're an Autobot. I think there was just a lot more freedom to do whatever we wanted with it.
Was it known to you at the time when you began the title that it was just going to be 12 issues and that's it, or was it maybe 12 and maybe we'll go more?
No, it was very much an ongoing title at first. We didn't know how long we had, but like I say, expectations weren't terribly high. We really, it was like, well, don't just do it ongoing in the extent that if we finish it, it's going to be mid-story or something. So we structured it in arcs. So, if we'd got another bunch of issues, we'd have done the slight escalation of that storyline, and, we put the Liege Maximo into the end of G2, even though we knew we wouldn't get to that. But that was the plan, just to go, I don't know whether we specifically said 12 issues, but it was like, here's the first story. It's going to be somewhat complete in and of itself. So doesn't matter if we don't get any further, or, we won't leave things dangling. But then if we do get another however many issues, we just expand the focus and continue to sort of beef up the storyline. But no, I think it was very much a kind of, we will wait and see how this goes.
Now, when you did Regeneration 1, you didn't just continue that. You went in a different direction. Was there ever, or are there ideas bouncing around in your head of, what if we had just kept going with the whole Liege Maximo thing?
Yeah, I mean, we even did a little convention story over here in the UK, a prose story called Alignment, that might or might not have been what we would do with G2 next. Certainly it was a kind of conclusion to the Liege Maximo storyline. But the fact is, we didn't really have much laid out at that point. It was, we knew pretty much by the time we got to issue 9 that we were only going to have the 12 issues. And, they gave us a double-sized one to finish off. But, it really was, I don't think, whatever plans we had, they were only partly formed, really. And so, no, I've never really, other than that alignment, gone there particularly. But, elements of G2 crept into Regeneration 1, that we took some of that and introduced those characters and some of those concepts like G-axis and the hub network. So, I think none of it is gone. It's just, it came out in different shapes and forms.
Well, G2 is also an interesting era of for Transformers fans, because I think at the time older fans were kind of in a transition period in their lives, right? Probably
Yeah.
around end of high school, college age, around that era, where just life takes you away from the things that you loved as a child sometimes. And there are folks like me who just never walked away from it and always stuck with it. But there are a lot of people who walked away because around G2, they said, oh, well, I already have this Jazz, or I already have this Optimus Prime, and this isn't offering me anything I didn't see before. And then the comic book, I don't get what's going on in this comic book, so I'm going to walk away. Then they come back to fandom 10, 15, 20 years later, and they look back on G2, and now all of a sudden it has this very interesting nostalgic appeal for them, because it is so different than what came before. And a lot of the toys, as you know, had some very interesting color on them. There were a lot
Yeah.
of pastels, very 90s colors on them. And now people, I think, find that charming in a very interesting way. And I think they look at the G2 title in the same way.
Yeah. I mean, I think G2, it's one of those ones, I'm the worst person for looking back at my own stuff, but, I think the G2 comic holds up pretty well, with the passage of time, in as much as I don't think we treated it, well, we treated it even less like these guys are toys and more like this is an action sci-fi series.
Right, absolutely. Now, fast forwarding again, so BotCon 97 rolls around and you're asked to write a story, but it is completely different, set in the Beast Wars universe. I'm guessing you were a little disconnected at that point. So was that a little weird for you?
Yeah, I mean, really disconnected. I mean, especially in the UK, where I don't know how much Beast Wars had come out at all. Both Andrew Wildman and I were just like, oh, okay, what's this? It looks a bit like Transformers, but it feels kind of different. So, when we were asked to write this story by the convention organizers, we had to do, they sent us over some tapes of episodes, so we could just kind of immerse ourselves in it a bit. But it was very much, obviously it was featuring the convention toys, so the focus was all on the characters like Packrat and Fractal, but we still had to have the grounding of what Beast Wars was. And the biggest surprise to us, I think, was not so much Beast Wars, but the fact that there was this fan community that had stayed loyal to it and had developed and and that there were conventions. And oh my god, there's I don't know how many were at that 97 convention, but there were a lot of people, and I think both of us were caught on the hop because we hadn't looked back to answer the questions that were going to fly our way on panels and things. So yeah, we were a little disconnected from not just Transformers, but the idea of a fandom wasn't there as far as we were concerned. So, when we came back for the 98 convention, we made damn sure we swatted up and knew what the hell we'd written, a decade or more ago.
Was it reaffirming in a way? Because you've been to several BotCons, just and you watched it grow, right? From like hundreds of attendees to thousands of attendees. Uh, that must have felt good for both you and Andrew to see your work from that time be so looked fondly upon.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, obviously, it's very flattering when, you realize that the stories you wrote, in a kind of just a professional capacity, you're writing stories, you're supplying material for a weekly or monthly publication. You have no real expectation they're going to have a kind of enduring appeal. And, especially pre-internet, there was never that sense of that people out there might still be talking about these. So, the conventions were wonderful in as much as, we both realized these meant something to people. I think that was the eye opener for us. We'd done it not in a way that we were just earning a paycheck. We put our heart and soul into the stories, but I don't think we had any idea that they would be as enduring as they were, and they would, in some ways become part of what became Transformers fandom as it came together.
And then your involvement with Beast Wars kept going. So you wrote the last episode of the Beast Wars Transformers series. Can you tell us how that came about?
Sure. I mean, at 97's convention, I met Bob Forward and Larry DiTilio, and we got on famously, really, really well. And obviously, I met the voice actors, and it was a very enjoyable social experience. But it was nice hearing from Bob and Larry that they'd taken elements like the Swarm and they'd become the Vok, and they were aware of my work, which was also whoa, you've looked back, you've seen this stuff. So and we just got on really, really well. And I think because they were immersing it more and more in G1 Beast Wars, drawing more and more connections, Bob was just keen on the idea. Well, Bob and Larry, I think, were just keen on the idea that I would do something for them that had a strong G1 connection. And we floated a few ideas around, one of which became a short story in a novella collection that came out a little later. But a lot of these ideas, and we were quite keen on a lot of them, just all got changed because suddenly there wasn't going to be another series of Beast Wars, and the only episode really were going to be one of the final two episodes. And so ended
Sorry,
up doing the last one, which was really strange.
But was it different writing television versus what you were used to with comic books?
Yeah, definitely. I relied a lot on Bob and Larry to hold my hand on this. There are similarities, but Bob had to really sort of be a strong editorial influence in the best way possible on what I was writing, because what happens on a TV screen in 22 minutes is quite different to what you can do in a comic book over a period of issues or whatever. It just had to be, it's quite a different discipline. And so they were really good. And, it just forged something with Bob and me, because I then went on to work on a bunch of other animated shows he was script editor on, like Roswell Conspiracies and Dan Dare and probably a couple of others, X-Men Evolution. So it really helped. Obviously he liked what I did enough, even though I really relied on him a lot to hone it, that we worked together for quite a while after that, and it really gave me my grounding in kids TV animation.
Speaking of editorial control, you and I got to work together years later, where you played that role when we wrote the Beast Wars source book for IDW, and then you wrote a miniseries. So you didn't get away from the Beast era yet, even after you wrote the last episode.
And I absolutely loved Beast Wars. I mean, genuinely, I was never the hugest fan of the original cartoon show. It was what it was. I love the movie, but Beast Wars felt like a very intelligent bit of writing for kids, which I really appreciated. It was witty, it was funny, it was a little anarchic. There was just intelligence behind it, and I think that's mostly down to Bob and Larry. They had such a good grasp of what the whole thing was, even though I know that evolved once you got involved in terms of what Beast Wars could be, but they were open to that. They just had a real sense of why should we bar the fandom if that's part of what this brand is. So, but they were really good about just, they wrote smart scripts, I think. And, they had other writers also writing really good storylines. And I genuinely loved Beast Wars. I can still dip in and out of those episodes. So, when it came to IDW and doing a Beast Wars series, I mean, it was almost a Dreamwave series originally. That was where the genesis of it was. Just before Dreamwave kind of crashed and burned, they were all set up to do a Beast Wars series. And I think originally it was James McDonough and Adam Patek, maybe.
That sounds right.
Yeah, who were going to be writing it. But then obviously for reasons we didn't know, they weren't going to be doing it at the time. And then it was me working with Don Figueroa. And so, we'd had this whole thing mapped out, first issue drawn, second issue maybe even drawn. So, that never happened. And so at least when we then got to work with IDW on Beast Wars, that was a case of, don't throw that out, take it and run with it. We'll adapt it somewhat so it's not the same, but the Magmatron storyline was there in the Beast Wars storyline. And let me just see if I can get rid of the sun on me, but yeah, just the Beast Wars storyline, I think, was very much what we intended for Dreamwave, but we adapted it for IDW.
And I had a lot of fun working on that. And I will credit you with when you worked with me on that and your guidance on giving me a lot of confidence when I wrote future BotCon comics. So I'm deeply appreciative of that.
Well, it was a pleasure working with you on that. And really, it definitely was I couldn't have done it without you.
Yeah, for those who are curious, there were spreadsheets there, and thank goodness we had the internet, because you and I could go back and forth every day on it. I can't imagine trying to do something like that like in the 80s. So let's pivot a bit here, because we've been talking Transformers a while now. One of my other favorite characters from you is Death's Head, but there may be folks watching who aren't totally familiar. Could you talk a little bit about where he came from and how he came to be, and how he kind of changed? He evolved a little bit over the years.
Yeah, sure. I mean, Death's Head was originally meant to be just a throwaway supporting character in a UK Transformers story. We needed a bounty hunter character. It was kind of, the storyline was a spaghetti western in space, and it felt right. We needed a bounty hunter, and we didn't really have a Transformer who fitted that bill. So we came up with Death's Head, and the idea was he would just get killed at the end of the storyline. So there's no sort of messy, he's not a Transformer, that, we can focus back on the robots. But, right from the start, when we saw Jeff Senior's visuals, we knew we had something kind of special. So we took steps to make him, a bit like Marvel did with Circuit Breaker, putting her in Secret Wars. We did it with Death's Head. We just did a little one-page storyline that once we'd initiated it, it copyrighted him as Marvel. And then we were free to use him in Transformers for a while and then move him out. So we shunted him through a Doctor Who story in the comic or magazine, into Dragon's Claws, then into his own title. And he's an interesting character in as much as the standard character, you have to, I suppose that character has to evolve, it has to grow or something as the comic goes on. They have to change, they go through arcs. But Death's Head is very much that he is what he is, that's it, nothing changes with him. He kills for profit and not else. There's no revenge or whatever else. So, structuring the stories meant that you had to have an interesting supporting cast, and you had to, put him in situations that created a conflict, but he's never going to be anything other than the character he is. And, there was a fair amount of humor about the character, from his sort of verbal tics to his attitude. And just generally, he seemed to really catch the imagination, really. And, when I moved on to other Marvel comics like She-Hulk and What If, I made sure that we got our Death's Head stories in there as well.
It always felt to me, and maybe because I read them kind of side by side, like Death's Head was a dark sci-fi action comedy that would fit right in like Heavy Metal magazine.
Yeah,
That's the kind of mood I always got from it.
I mean, I think he was definitely more like a kind of 2000 AD style character, the British comic, where they're slightly more subversive, not necessarily heroic, and there's a big tradition in British comics of lead characters that really aren't, sometimes they're outright villains, sometimes they're, just not very nice people. I just think it came out of that more than anything, that he doesn't obey the strict, Marvel hero guidelines. He's more, of an oddity, an anti-hero, and in some ways he sort of predated that more 90s Punisher anti-hero vogue that happened, the Venom type thing. I think he was a little ahead of the curve on that, in terms of he was not any kind of character to sort of hold up as an icon or anything, but you kind of love him
So,
regardless.
but then so eventually, and this I know was not your decision, Marvel decides, because it was the 90s and everything was extreme, right? Even GI Joe went extreme, right?
Yeah.
So they decided basically to do Death's Head Extreme, which was Death's Head 2. And it was always weird to me because I was such a big fan of the original, and I read that story that kind of led up and inferred that Death's Head personality was kind of overtaking this android, right? Okay, great. And I thought, okay, so he basically just got a new body, except as I read the title, he was nothing like everything you just described. And eventually, I know you did get a chance to write a what if, to play with the scenario of Death's Head winning, that are Death's Head instead of the android, right, or the creature. And how did that feel? Was that something that you had kind of pent up for years and you were happy to finally do?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I was always a little disappointed. Jeff Senior and I were actually underway in terms of, a new Death's Head series, and it was always disappointing to me that we never, we were literally, we'd drawn a first issue. I think maybe the second one was written, so it was a shame that we never really got to do that. I think that was, sorry, I just managed to get sun on right on my head at the moment, but
No
it's
worries.
it's one of those things where we were just a little disappointed, I think, a little niggled that we didn't get to finish that series, and that Death's Head 2 wasn't really Death's Head, so we couldn't quite understand why call him Death's Head at all, just do a new character. But hey, that's the way. But yes, it did feel a little bit cathartic, I suppose, to do our what if, that rewrote that little bit of character, crossover, I guess.
Well, and now in our modern era of Marvel comic books, continuity be damned.
Yeah,
Death Head 2, for the most part, doesn't exist anymore the way he did before.
right.
And now he seems back to his old self to a large
Yeah.
degree.
It's funny, lots of creators came on board, British creators like Kieran Gillen and others who'd obviously kind of grown up reading the character and liking the character, and then they started dropping them into their Marvel books. So Kieran put him in Iron Man and Sword, and just generally he started to sort of filter in from that generation down of creators, until the point where he's become, quite a Marvel mainstay guest star, if you like. I mean, they did a little mini series with him recently. They bought out that collected edition of all his early stuff. So just generally, he seems to have become, I think he got a Marvel figure at one point, a little action figure. So, just generally, I think he's been absorbed into mainstream Marvel now, which is very, very satisfying.
It's great. And I know you had written Death's Head 3.0 kind of as a standalone miniseries. But even I think in the latest title, that miniseries you referred to, now they've kind of integrated that into this kind of blended continuity
Yeah,
of Death's Head. And I love thinking that there's this corner of the Marvel universe as it exists today that is just a Death's Head orama, that he is this hugely influential figure where he has, I guess, what we could call a son, you know,
yeah,
and these other bots kind of based on him.
yeah. It's nice. I mean, Death Set 3.0 was a strange one because originally that was a fan vote online to bring back a character. You had a choice of 4 or 5, and Death's Head won. And so originally it was meant to be the original Death's Head, but at the last minute, it seemed we kind of got saddled with that being from Planet Hulk storyline. And it wasn't connected to the original Death's Head. So, I mean, I enjoyed Death's Head 3.0, but I do wish we got that chance to do the original character then.
Yeah, 3.0 felt like, you said before, almost like a 2000 AD series.
Yeah.
Kind of something that would have just been in the title, like for a limited number of issues. And I enjoyed it, but I I kind of enjoy the character more when he's part of a much larger world.
Yeah.
And plus, 3.0 obviously had a very different personality than original Death's Head.
Yeah.
But I am so glad that he's back
Yeah.
in his proper personality, in his proper body, in modern day Marvel. The day he appears, even in the background in an MCU film, I think we've just come full circle if that ever happens.
That would be very nice.
So going back to Transformers, now you haven't walked away from the franchise. Recently, the trade paperback for 84 Secrets and Lies came out. I tore through it, and it's funny because for someone like me who read the original issues that you're weaving these stories in and out of, it's a nostalgia trip, but at the same time you're trying to figure out this new story that you
Yeah.
integrated. And I feel like earlier we had talked about how when you were just doing the UK title, you would sometimes have to weave things in and out with the US title. So was this kind of flexing that old muscle again to do that?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, when this was originally floated, it was just a one shot. I think it was keyed into the 35th anniversary or whatever. And originally it was, well, let's just weave some stuff we didn't see from the beginning of the Marvel US comic. But then I suggested to IDW that maybe we could be even kind of more twisty turny and bring in that original UK story, Man of Iron, which had never really sat comfortably in the continuity of either comic. And we just thought, let's do this in such a way that it marries it up into the continuity and is also becomes part of this whole you know stuff you never knew about these original comics. And also it felt right that we've got the original few Marvel comics, US comics, and the very first UK story in there. And then because we got a mini series, it's like, well, wow, we get a chance to broaden that out and really get into the nitty gritty of characters like Straxus and bring in a lot more of what was happening on Cybertron. And it was a delight from start to finish. And Guido and JP just did such a stellar job on making the artwork part of that era. So it's modern but not too modern. It was such a fun thing to work on.
I think Man of Iron was one of my first stories I read from the UK that was in the time where I was now aware of the UK and I had kind of caught up on the UK stories.
Sure. And it
So
got reprinted, of course, in the
yes,
US comic.
first of all, I love the art in those issues. It was so moody and so dark compared to any other issues really.
Yeah.
Um, did you have a little bit of consternation about using Cloudbreaker and Fastlane in place of kind of the models that were used in that old issue?
No, I think, the whole storyline of Man of Iron is set up almost like a bit of apocrypha. It's a story handed down. And I felt like, well, if that's the story handed down, we can, you know, we can improve on that and make them, and I wanted it to be, characters who could just about conceivably have been the Man of Iron character, and not sort of, and that in itself was a challenge, to find some characters who'd never featured in the UK or US comic book. But yeah, it was fun. I love these challenges. I love, that kind of retro looking at things, and finding ways to integrate what at first glance seems a little unintegratable.
I was going to ask you about that actually. Did you have, before you wrote it, did you have to do all this research and say, who did I not use or or destroy or whoever?
I had to go back a bit, and also ask people who know these things better than me, even though I was very involved. So JP was a good sounding board on all this. Sometimes he would say, wait a second, you've got that character there, but I think we had one of the Constructicons on Cybertron.
Mm.
He said, but they're created on Earth. I said, well, I think we can get around that and say they were reconstructed on Earth. But I love that kind of jigsawing, slotting things together, trying to find a cast of characters that had never made it into the either comic book to any degree. So yeah, it was a challenge, but an immensely enjoyable one.
Yeah, one thing toward the end of the trade that I found really interesting that you did was you brought, I'll use, for lack of a better term, to life, Hoist, Smokescreen, several of those characters who didn't actually appear till later in the US title. And you made a differentiation between their memory engrams and I guess what would nowadays in Transformers parlance be called their spark.
Yeah.
And I didn't see that coming. And I found that to be an interesting concept. How did you come to that?
Well, I think I needed to rationalize some of the things Bob dropped into those original issues, because there was a tendency sometimes to make the Transformers seem like they could be stored on a computer chip or something. And I guess I never was very happy with that. So I felt the need to say, look, this is that. There's intelligence, there's personality, and then there's the spark. And it'd come a long way since those original stories, the whole concept of what a transformer is. And I just felt the need, I think, to try and rationalize some of that and say, this is how it worked, this is why they were able to do that back then. So it's sometimes it's not exactly papering over the cracks, that makes it sound wrong, but it's certainly like we know so much more about Transformers now, so we can't be simplistic about this, so this needs a bit of explanation.
Adding layers to the lore, which is something you've done before, and something Bob's done before. And I think when you combine a lot of that base lore you both created in G1, it equals a pretty strong foundation for what everyone else has done since, from animated programs to other comic books and so on.
Yeah, definitely.
So continuing your travel through media, across media on Transformers, you're also working on Space Apes Transformers Earth Wars mobile game. How did that come about, and what has that experience been like? Because that can't be the same as writing a comic book or a TV show.
No, I mean, Earth Wars is a little strange in as much as I write storylines that are, you can play the game without looking at any of the storylines. The characters come in and you carry on playing the game. But, they really wanted, Chris White, who was the game lead on Earth Wars, was a big Transformers fan. A lot of the people working on it were, and I think they wanted Earth Wars to have some some kind of standing of its own. I think they wanted it to matter, rather than just it's a game. It's a game in the build and battle genre, but they wanted it to be, well, look, we're dealing with this franchise. We've got these amazing characters. Let's do more with them. And so they had me come in and do some storylines. And, we're now 5 years or so into Earth Wars. And, we've got so many characters. And, there's such a wealth of storyline that probably will never see the light of day otherwise, but it's great. We have a lot of fun with it. We never don't take it seriously, but we're allowed to do some little sort of breaking the fourth wall, or knowing nods and things like that in the dialogues. And just generally it's a fun game to work on. And as much as possible we try and make it proper G1. We really looked at, whenever we bring the characters in, we look at their existing tech specs, maybe we adapt them a little bit, but generally, it's its own little universe, but we want it to be as pure kind of G1 as possible.
Well,
Even though we've got Beast Wars in there, and,
I was
and
about to
Armada
say.
and a whole bunch of other stuff.
Well, one of my favorite parts was I think the game introduced like yet another Megatron at one point, and all the dialogue.
There's about three Megatrons.
Yeah,
Just
that was what the
second.
dialogue was. The dialogue was just about how many Megatrons there were now running around in one universe.
That's better. I was just sort of disappearing into the gloom after the sun there.
But I'm glad you're on. I'm glad they kept you on it, because I was afraid they were just going to kind of bring you on in the beginning and kind of like launch the ship, and then they were just not going to use you again at all.
Yeah, no, I mean, and I wouldn't have, had any criticism if that was their plan, sort of. But no, strangely, it's become a kind of happy arrangement that just really works. And they don't show any sign of stopping this in the future either. So yeah,
probably one of the longest surviving Transformers mobile games.
Yeah.
I think maybe the only other one that's lasted as long as, oddly, the Angry Birds one. So let's move on to something else you're working on currently, and have been for quite a few years now, is To the Death, which is on your background. For those who aren't familiar, why don't you tell us all about it? Like, where did it come from? What is it? How can we get it? So on.
Sure. Well, To the Death is the sort of the first proper creator-owned thing I've worked on. It's with Jeff Senior, of course, and I think we both wanted to go back to that kind of world building we did with Dragon's Claws, and just do a big sci-fi, I mean, blockbuster movie was how we looked at it. We, even it originally we published it digitally, and it was all done in a series of screen-sized panels. So, Jeff looked at it very much like a movie shooting board. And, we went back to that kind of, all sort of dystopian future, sort of combat for entertainment. There's a kind of bounty hunter character in it. It's almost like all our greatest hits rolled into something new, and we hope, really sort of enduring in itself. We did a 10-issue maxi series once we turned it into print, and that's all out now, and we've collected in a couple of slipcases, which I believe you can order in the US through Diamond, both the slipcases. And then just recently there's a anthology title here called Shift, and we've just done some new To the Death material for that, which will again look to bring out down the line, probably in some kind of one shot that will get through Diamond. But you can, we have a website for To the Death. It's to-the-death.com, and that has all the links to the series. You can sort of immerse yourself in the world. And like I say, it's a real sort of, sort of kick-ass action sci-fi blockbuster, sort of one man against an impossibly corrupt system in the future. And yeah, it's just that kind of, stuff Jeff does so well, which is, you know, full throttle action, alien worlds, future Earths. You know, it's just a sort of non-stop, sort of escalating series that, builds towards to a kind of almost truly earth-shaking conclusion. So yeah, we're really pleased with it. And it's very much complete in and of itself, the first 10 issue series. And then we've taken elements of that forward into another storyline set within that universe. So it's very much something we hope to build upon over the next few years. But self-publishing, it's tough. It takes a lot of investment of money and time to do. And To the Death is a big thing. It's something like 450, 60 pages worth of comic strip. So it's lovely to have it out there. We still, it's still available to buy in slipcases. You can go to getmycomics.com, which is a web-based comic store, and that is a shop window for To the Death, really, and Shift, the comic it now appears in.
I it started as digital, right? And I know that's a format that other writers and creatives have played with. I guess I'm such a traditionalist. I was very happy once it was on paper, so I could like hold it in my hand and read it that way.
And me too. I mean, I'm a print and paper guy, but initially it made more sense to us to put it out there digitally. But I think we always had an eye on the fact that it would be print and paper, and we did it in a prestige format that really each issue is quite chunky, 48 pages or whatever. So we wanted it to be a proper good chunk of storytelling, but complete enough that people don't feel shortchanged at the end of it.
Right. Especially, I notice. I think comics have on average about 2 less pages than they used to nowadays, and they go by very fast. And for
Yeah.
some reason, I don't remember getting through issues as quickly individually as I do now. So when you have something substantial like that in your hand, I read a lot of trades nowadays, so it always feels nice to have that complete story in your hand. So I didn't know about the binded ones. I'm going to ask my comic shop to order those.
Yeah. No, I think it's now gone out through Diamond to US stores, so it's orderable, in the States.
Excellent. Now, so to wrap everything up, what else do you have going on? Anything else we should be looking forward to?
Sure. Well, I mean, I'm doing a few things. Sadly, I can't talk about at the moment, but I am writing. I've been writing a lot for Rebellion, who published 2000 AD. I've been working on their sort of classic British superhero line. I did a thing called The Vigilant, which was a team book. And I recently have started writing Leopard from Lime Street in a bi-monthly comic, which again is a classic British hero revisited. And I continue to work on Earth Wars. I'm doing some other games work at the moment, which is probably a year or more hence in terms of actual release. And yeah, just doing movie writing. We're still pushing. I work with film journalist Mark Salisbury on spec scripts often, but we've got a couple of things in the sort of process now that have a little more momentum about them. So we're finding some time to work on those. And just generally, sort of really focusing as much as possible on, developing more creator-owned material. I'm working with artist Martin Stiff, who did Tiny Acts of Violence, on a new thing, which is going to, we hope, come out, if not this year, next year. A bit of a crime noir thing. So you just generally, as much as possible, I like to be working on, my projects now rather than just sort of company owned projects.
No, and that,
And
it
I'll always
takes
have room for more Transformers, of course.
a certain amount of boldness, I think, to do creator initiated things, especially given, even for the big guys, the industry isn't what it used to be. So it's a very difficult thing, I know from what I've read of the industry, and I'm glad that you have so many balls up in the air at one time, because that means we get to look forward to a diverse type of writing coming from you, and it shouldn't all just be Transformers, right? It should be other things too.
But there's always Transformers.
Absolutely, never ends, right?
Absolutely. Never
All
does.
right. Well, Simon, thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate your time. I'm really looking forward to those mysterious projects that you can't talk about yet. Looking forward to more Earth Wars. And hey, whoever the heck gets the Transformers comic license after IDW, don't forget about bringing Mr. Furman on board. Thank you, Simon.
Thank you, Ben. Much appreciated.
And that was my interview with Simon Furman. I'd like to thank Simon once again for joining me for this interview. And I'd like to thank you, the viewer, for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please hit that like button. And if you like what I do on this channel, please subscribe. In the description below, I've linked to various ways you can contact Simon online yourself on social media, as well as his To the Death website. There are more interviews coming in the future, so keep an eye out. Thank you for joining me. May your luster never dull and your wires never cross.